Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. And I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Maaz Gardezi, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Virginia Tech University. He has a bachelor's in economics from the University of Bath in the UK, a master's in environmental policy from the University of Michigan, which we're not allowed to say out loud, and a PhD in sociology and sustainable agriculture from Iowa State University, which is a wonderfully diverse background in terms of disciplinary training and orientation. A lot of his work, and the reason I know him is through our shared interests in the use of social science to understand processes of innovation and how technology and new innovations have impacts on society and their origin story, or how they're designed and created, is something that we recognize can vary quite a bit from place to place, and something that is worthy of kind of deliberate study. I heard him speak this summer at one of my professional meetings, and became excited about a project that he's leading and is funded by the National Science Foundation, that focuses in on these questions about how best to design an innovation process surrounding precision agriculture, which is one of our focuses here in ICICLE. And in particular, the need for being conscious about the process through which we develop artificial intelligence and precision agricultural solutions is going to affect the willingness and interest of farmers to use this technology. And there's a lot of interest in my shop, my lab, and others that I work with around the world that think that there are values in having a more transparent and inclusive process, and doing a lot of that innovation in the real world, in living labs, is I think what Maaz will talk about. And so I'm excited he was willing to make some time for us, and hope he also gets something good out of meeting our ICICLE community. So with that, fire away.
Thank you, Doug, for that introduction. So the topic that I'm going to present today is on responsible innovation in precision agriculture. And this is a collaborative work that has come about in collaboration with Virginia Tech, South Dakota State University, and University of Vermont. But before I discuss that work, I just want to give a brief overview of my own research, which is really at the intersection of three systems: so social, cyber, environmental systems. So you can think about social systems made up of people, group, and institutions. And so people are to be given some rules, or people develop some rules in ways in which they can understand or behave in certain ways in their social systems. Then you have the physical environmental systems, like in agriculture, there could be living organisms. They could also include analog technologies and some larger environmental systems. And then you have the cyber systems that are made up of data, algorithms, and software. So all of these systems, cyber systems, social system, physical systems, have their own rules, and they're governed by certain rules. And so at the intersection of the social and the physical system, some of the work that I do is on agriculture, environmental policy, on climate change adaptation policy. Some of the work that I do on the intersection of social and cyber systems relate to questions about regulation of big data. How do you govern AI? What are some of the ways in which AI will reconfigure farm and farm workers? And then I do a lot of collaborative work with people in computer science and other engineering disciplines, where we do the integration of the cyber physical systems. So how do we collect data? How do we process this? How do we manage it? Those type of questions. So precision agriculture is at the core of a social cyber physical system. It's been considered as a digital revolution that's taking place not just in the US, but outside. That is being driven by technologies such as data, artificial intelligence, and robotics. And really the goal is that, what are some of the ways in which we can enhance the existing physical or process-based models and move towards more hybrid process-based models, or ways in which we can develop data-driven models to understand different processes that exist in the natural environment, in the physical environment. So that could be things like, how do you decide how much nutrients you want to use, how much carbon there is in the soil, when should you harvest, and how much you should spray, and all those things. Those are decisions that can be driven by data. And as a result of it, because it has shown some promise, some has been able to meet some of the promises that it initially started out with, So that it has recently become both a national as well as a global priority for policymakers. So the work that I'm presenting today is a collaboration that is generously funded by the National Science Foundation under their Future of Work at the Human Technology Frontier Program. We are working in 3 states. So we are working in South Dakota, Vermont, and Virginia. And the reason why we have these 3 states is because they really represent different social, environmental, political systems. So South Dakota, very large-scale agriculture systems, very much reliant on corn and soybean or monocropping systems. A very conservative government. In terms of the nitrogen is really the matter of concern for them, the pollutant of concern for them. But for farmers, that's also an input and therefore a cost in their cost of business. In Vermont, we're looking at organic farming, agroecology, a lot of permaculture, small-scale farming systems, new types of crops such as cannabis, and a lot of focus on dairy as well, and in Virginia as well, similar types of diversified farming systems, and the matter of concern over there in both in Vermont and Virginia is phosphorus at the state level. And the reason for that is because of the issues with water quality and issues around hypoxia in the Gulf, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So for those reasons, we selected these 3 states, and the focus of this presentation today is on responsible innovation, because that's the work that we do and so what do we mean by responsible innovation, and where is this coming from? So responsible innovation is, broadly speaking, is the idea that you move the moral compass of technological development to the early stages of technological development, right? What that basically means is that instead of thinking about what the impact of technology would be much later, once it's produced or developed, we start thinking about those implications at the earlier stages. And one of the ways in which that can be done is now defined according to these principles. And these 4 principles are called anticipation, inclusion, reflexivity, and responsiveness. So some of the things that I'm going to be presenting today will touch upon these 4 principles. So when I say anticipation, it really means exploring and predicting the potential consequences of a future innovation. Inclusion would mean including diverse stakeholders from the beginning to end and sharing power. Reflexivity would mean that holding a mirror up to your own activity as a research team. And responsiveness would mean that you develop institutions that can quickly respond to new forms of knowledge, regulations, and technologies. So overall, responsible innovation is both reactive, but also very, very proactive in terms of ensuring that the potential or plausible risk of a technology can be understood, and then some steps can be taken more urgently. So in order to achieve responsible innovation, the methodology that we use is called the Living Labs. And Living Labs has come out of more from the European Union. And the basic premise is, again, that we're trying to understand how decisions are made on the farm, because eventually these technologies are going to be used by farmers. It's going to be having an implication on farm workers. So we really think about farm as a unit on which innovation takes place. And what does that mean? That basically means that we understand how a farmer makes decisions on their farm without trying to disrupt the patterns or their management practices too much. So it's a very hands-off observational way of doing research. But it doesn't stop there. So it doesn't just only observe what farmers are doing, it brings them into the research itself. So the questions come from the farmers, what research questions we should be pursuing as a team, how we should be conducting research, and even some of the analysis of the data will be done by the farmers themselves. So the idea is that we are learning from farmers and we are thinking of them not just as users of technology, but truly as co-producers and co-evaluators of technology. And I'll talk through some of the steps that we have used so far. But this is a project that is currently in progress. So I'll be sharing some results, but others we're still kind of working towards. So let's talk about one of the main principles, in my view. I think if you can achieve this as a team, you can potentially address many of the problems, at least on the socio-technical side of issues. So multi-stakeholder anticipatory processes, which basically means bringing diverse stakeholders together, can lead to more socially relevant knowledge and innovations, can provide legitimacy to innovation and policy processes, can stimulate learning and reflection among stakeholders, and contribute to the democratization of innovation, which I believe ICICLE is really pursuing. So these are theoretically, these are great ideas, but what does that mean? So when we think about anticipation from a technological point of view, and you ask an engineer, what does anticipation mean? This is perhaps what comes to their mind. The idea that, where is the technology right now? What would it look like in the next 5 to 10 years? How much of that is sort of like based on tropes of disillusionment or illusionment, enlightenment? And so some of those ideas may actually turn into reality, but others may not be able to fulfill their promises. But when we think about social anticipation, we're really thinking about what are some of the perspectives, what are some of the capacities that people have at different levels, at the farm level, at the policy-making level, at the private sector level. So we're really thinking about what are the implications of these technologies across a wide range of stakeholders. And so anticipation isn't new. We've always had in us this ability to think about the futures. And this is from a calendar that was published by Shell back in 1957. And it really showcases how people in 1950s were thinking about the future of farming. It shows there's a farmer or farm manager who's basically applying some ammonia on their farm, and they're sitting in a control room with a variety of dashboards showing different imagery. It shows a robot kind of picking cotton, and it just symbolizes the idea that this isn't something new to us. So we have always been imagining these different futures, but futures are powerful because they do condition actions today. So with a multi-stakeholder engagement, we had 3 sites, so South Dakota, Vermont, Virginia. We were thinking about what are some of the ways in which we can bring people together, ask them questions about responsibility, how do they trust these new technologies, what are some concerns that they have with them, and this included both usual and unusual suspects. So we really tried to include a diverse range of stakeholders in this process. And some of the analytical approaches that we've used or are currently using include qualitative as well as quantitative methods. So one of the first things we learned from this process was, that policy solutions or real practical solutions will require cooperation between industry, nonprofit, policymakers, and users. So what you see on your screen is basically like, stakeholders, whether they're from technology firms or whether they're from nonprofit or they're farmers or they're extension agents, they really were interested in the question of trust. How can they trust precision agriculture to be making predictions that they would actually find reliable and useful for them? So all of that information that is being given to them, first of all, is it useful and usable? Secondly, there were lots of concerns across the stakeholder range about labor markets. What happens to people on my farm? Do I have to keep looking for new farm workers every year? What are some of the ways in which I can automate these processes? There were some questions about science communication, like, what are some best ways in which we can understand these in much simpler ways? Some people were more interested in decision support tools, like, can I have a gadget or some kind of a decision support tool that is being driven by artificial intelligence and can answer some of the questions that I have about my farm? And then there were some questions that were specifically related to dairy farming and automation. But the idea being that, yes, we need cooperation, but at the same time, we sort of have to think about ways in which people across the stakeholder groups have the ability to negotiate their rights and their contracts. And the reason I say that is because there were some qualitative things that I want to share with you. And the number one was this whole idea of capital accumulation that can take place because a lot of data is being collected by very few large agri-tech companies. So one of the Vermont farmers said, I find it problematic that if I buy a John Deere piece of equipment and I generate a boatload of data driving my field, my crops that I harvest with my inputs that I cover, that I don't get the data without permission and access. And then that defines my degree of success. So not knowing what happens to the data, but really not having enough control on their data is a concern among farmers. Another South Dakota farmer said it's scarier in agriculture because it's not Target trying to sell you more diapers. It's all of a sudden your bottom line. If there's a dollar sucked out of the market because a giant company with lots of money saw something coming before you did, that's hard. So really thinking about ways in which a lot of what the companies can do affects the bottom line or the economic profits for farmers. And on a broader scale, what we are also finding from these conversations is that there is this idea that a lot of these technologies are being developed for a specific type of farmer, which is very large scale monoculture crops, farmer growing monoculture crops. And here's a precision agriculture hardware developer from Vermont, New York area, who basically said that in the industry, we're seeing sort of call it consolidation or monoculture emerging in the technologies as well. So, row crops are the first target for precision ag because you have a ton of land, you can manage all with the same methods, all have the same big data set to learn about. And the small producers or the diverse producers are left out because it's not an attractive economic target. And that is true because if you look at where the farm tech landscape is in 2020, amongst a range of technologies that are being developed, very few are being imagined to be used by smallholder farmers. So these were some of the things that we were learning from these discussions. And what we wanted to do is to address some of these concerns. We can't possibly address all of the concerns, such as corporate power, but we could at least address concerns that may help with some recommendations in the form of ways in which these technologies can be used both for increasing productivity, but also for social and environmental well-being. So our process for the Living Lab is pretty simple. We start out with identifying who are the farmers that we can work with. So that includes a number of different approaches. You could, in Virginia, for instance, we partnered with Virginia State University. It has a small farm outreach program. It includes a lot of historically Black, it's a historically Black university. And therefore, a lot of farmers that are working around it are Black farmers. And so those are some of the ways we were trying to improve the diversity of farmers that we could include in our sample. In South Dakota, a lot of the farmers that we recruited had already adopted precision ag technologies. And therefore, for that reason, they were also very large scale farmers. In Vermont, our range included anywhere between 15 acres to 150 to even 200 acres. And we included a diverse type of farmers who some of them were doing permaculture and agroecology, others were focusing on conventional agriculture systems. So through our approach of bringing farmers into this project, talking to them about this entire process and what does it entail, that really built trust at the beginning. And instead of not knowing or not sharing enough knowledge, I think one of the things that really helped us in building this trust is to share as much information as possible, tell them where our limitations are, what are some of the things that we want to learn, what are we going to do with the data that we collect from them, how are they going to benefit, whether monetary or non-monetary, and if there are any risks. But it has to be in a way that it's as transparent as possible. So we start out with the farmer interviews and surveys. Farmers basically help us identify at least four fields on their farms that we can, I'll just talk about that in a moment, where we can do some experiments which I'll describe in just a moment. But on each field, we have several campaigns. We have a drone campaign, we have some soil testing campaign, and we have satellite imagery campaigns. So here's an example of that. So we use, in this case, Sentinel-2 imagery. This is cloud-free Sentinel-2 imagery over every month that we generated during the growing season, and then we cross-reference it with soil samples to be able to produce some yield maps or some phosphorus maps. Then we brought those maps and the farmers together into a design workshop. Again, I'm going to explain that in more detail in just a moment. And we developed what are some of the ways in which we can design these decision support tools that would be useful for farmers, but also what are some possible future farming scenarios that could come out. And based on that, we had larger sessions, but we brought those maps and that information to the farmers to in order to improve it, but also to ask them ways in which we can any other further questions they have that we can address as part of our research. So let me just quickly go into some detail. Here's some of the locations of the farmers. So we have farmers spread out in Virginia, more on the eastern side of South Dakota, and in Vermont we have around the Lake Champlain Basin. Sorry, one of the things I would say is that initially when we brought these farmers, we weren't really expecting them to be interested in one or the other. So almost all farmers are interested in yield, which makes sense. But then there were some farmers who were more interested in soil health and other farmers who were more interested in water quality. And one of the things we were able to do was to kind of group them based on whether the living lab is soil health or water quality. And I think this grouping is helping us because eventually when we do any peer-to-peer learning, we can build on these living labs as groups instead of individual farms. So we start out with the interviews and surveys. We did this in person in South Dakota, Virginia, Vermont. We asked them questions about their management practices, how they trust existing nutrient recommendations, what are their concerns about AI and big data in general. We also discussed some new policies, including payment for ecosystem services, which I'm going to explain to you in just a moment. And then we created some field maps and then just got their perspective of how they would draw these field maps or how they would interpret these field maps. And this basically brings me to another aspect of our project, which is to use the living lab as a way to practice environmental governance. So far, I have been talking about technology as a way to make predictions, for instance, about yield or of nitrogen and phosphorus. That's the key goal of our project. But one of the things we want to do is each farm is divided into 4 fields. And one of the field is a control group, another is a treatment group, a second is a treatment 2, and the third is our treatment 3. And each of these fields are where farmers have a sort of a unique management practice. And what we do is basically we ask farmers, in the control group, we give them results from a basic process-based model like APEX or DayCent. APEX is used for predicting, estimating, phosphorus. DayCent is for carbon. And basically, we give them what are the existing models. For treatment 1, we give them a slightly better model, which is data-driven, where we've used AI to parameterize existing process-based models. For treatment 2, we're not just giving them we're giving them additional money based on what percentage of nitrogen or phosphorus they're able to reduce, and they're getting the basic model. And in treatment 3, they're getting the better model, and they're also getting an additional incentive based on whether they're able to reduce their nitrogen or phosphorus. So basically, through this experiment, two things we want to learn. One is, do incentives matter, especially when they're performance-based? And number 2, do better models work? Are they better for incentivizing more environmental practices? So first, relying on existing models and improving it, and then relying on basic monetary incentives, which is every farmer gets for being part of our project, and then giving them additional dollars, actual dollars, right? With that can actually be used for incentivizing them to do better for the environment. So this is being done in the real life, in the real world. On the other hand, we've also created a video game, right, which can basically get to the same idea, but in the form of a simulation. And this isn't the actual video game that we're developing for this project, but this is an example from another serious game that we've designed. And basically, the idea is that, again, farmers are given these different conditions, or these are different interventions, whether they get some information or better information, whether they have like an ordinary model or a better model. And by better model, I mean like a process-based model that also provides bias corrections. They can provide some level of uncertainty because that could be useful for farmers. or the actual payment, like whether they get more money as a result of reducing their nitrogen or phosphorus use. So anyways, we can also simulate the same experiment in the serious games that are being developed. And then what we're learning from the development of the games, as well as the outputs that we're learning from our AI team, we're bringing it into the design workshop for understanding what are some best ways to visualize that data, whether it's 2D or 3D maps, what are some of the things that farmers would like to see first, displayed on a dashboard, but also questions about speculation, right? So this kind of takes us back to the idea of anticipation. And here's an example of how that workshop was actually put together. This is on a Miro board where we were designing how the workshop is actually going to map and then present the different scenarios and then design different tools and so on, then prototype. But here's an example of what we did. We created, along with the farmers, we basically created newspaper headlines. And this one says that a small-scale Vermont farmer reduces phosphorus runoff by 20% in 2 years, while maintaining yield. So if you are the farmer, how was this achieved? So kind of using newspapers as a way to speculate, because this is a newspaper from the future, but also a way to make them think about, what are some of the things that they would have to do today in order to do better for the environment. Here's another example of the same speculated prototype that we've developed, that can kind of trigger this idea that we need to do something today in order to help us with some of the environmental challenges we have. And then finally, one of the things we did in the design workshop was to present these different futures of farms. So these are all hand-drawn images of what are some of the futures technologies that might exist. Some of them are perhaps even more bizarre than others. But the idea is we wanted to get a sense of where the farmers are in terms of their own speculation of the future. So I'll just read number 7, soil sensors making digital field grid, farmers reviewing cover crop options through augmented reality simulations. So this isn't very far from reality. In fact, some of the companies are already exploring this. But what we wanted to see was, what if farmers had to sort this in our design workshops? What would they place as being more realistic and less realistic? So overall, I think to summarize all the different activities that we're kind of bringing towards understanding how we can use the Living Lab as a piece towards approaching responsible innovation, some of the conclusions that I want you to take away today is, number one, that farmers, technology developers, policymakers are really interested in precision agriculture tools that can reconnect nature and culture. So whereas yield maps are visual representations of reality, like the one that I'm showing here, they're not the reality themselves. So what are some of the ways in which farmers' local knowledge can also be used to augment the ability of AI to do better? And there are several different ways in which that can be done. Our team is applying different iterative cycles of adaptive learning in our AI technologies. But what are some of the other ways in which we can probably rely on crowdsourcing, in ways in which we can understand farmers' traditional knowledge and bridge it with some of the new knowledge that they can learn from satellite imagery, drones, and sensors? The second takeaway is that we would like to go for a precision agriculture that unites life and avoids hierarchies. And so, one of the things we're seeing is, what are some ways in which some plants are more important than others? So current nutrient recommendation models are prioritizing very specific crops under very specific management practices and in very specific biophysical conditions. And the more we specify things, the less precise it would be for other types of crops and other types of farming systems. And similarly, what are some of the ways that AI can apply tools methods such as transfer learning to be able to learn from areas where there is more data available, such as in South Dakota, and then be able to say something about where there's less data available, such as farms in Vermont and Virginia. But this also makes us think about some policy and some political questions about what should be included in the Farm Bill in the ways in which we can prioritize other types of crops and other types of farmers who are trying to grow or trying to come back to farming. and or trying to do other things that are more important for the rural communities than just for crop production. And again, some farm workers are also more important than others. And so one of the questions that keeps coming, especially in the dairy industry, is, well, lots of questions, but labor is a big input. And so what are some of the ways in which robotics are going to replace? And the third one, which kind of ties those two things together, is what are some of the ways in which we can integrate AI with farm workers and work for sustainability? So AI can be difficult to explain and validate for farmers and agronomists. What are some of the ways in which we can make the process more explainable to farmers? And what are some of the ways in which we can think about their capacity as the one that needs to be built as a result of this? So with that, I would like to thank all of you for attending this session, and let's see if people have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Maaz. Any questions, Maaz?
I had a kind of a process question for you, Maaz. First of all, this is an excellent project, and I wish we were part of it. So I've been thinking I need to get information out to a number of the people that I work with here on the Wisconsin campus. My question was, I just noticed in one of the slides you had of a design workshop, and I'm wondering if you found if it was easier or better to do co-design work in person or online.
So we did it in person. We didn't try it online. I have tried to do it online, and I think it works better for those people who are tech savvy to engage in co-design work online. But with farmers, especially with the older farmers in South Dakota, like the in-person design workshops were extremely useful. One of the things I also found fascinating was that I wasn't expecting farmers to have fun with the design workshop. Because I thought they were going to say, why are you wasting all our time? And we're busy people. But the way they were playing with Lego, and then the way they were kind of prototyping some of those things and moving things in the decision support tool, I felt like that they were really excited about the whole process. And so like depending on when people schedule it, like if it's in the winter or during the winter, farmers would be more inclined to come in person and attend.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Raghu?
Oh, hi, Maaz, good talk. So, you talked about design and being hard, well, the design versus teaching design, okay, either online or or in person. So, I think at least the dogma is that it's better to teach in person. Okay, so we have a program on campus here in data analytics. It's completely online. It includes, of course, statistics. It also includes computer science. And what is unique about this program, it also includes design. Okay, so well, this program was launched, in the heyday of the pandemic, right? So we had no choice. So our colleagues in design were actually quite against it, okay, but they didn't have a choice, right? So everything was remote. So just, it's not really, I really don't have a question there, but I wanted to really tell you something about, the I guess the cultural differences, right, of, that design has vis-a-vis other disciplines. There, I think they believe that it's really best taught in person when you're in the same room, right? You share a space, physical space, and so on. So just a comment, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I know that I have seen myself people doing some really exciting work that's done online, purely online, and I would be very interested in seeing like how they did that especially for rural, I think, communities where like just bringing people together can be sometimes very difficult. Like the distances are too far away, the infrastructure isn't available, either like digital or the actual infrastructure. But yeah, okay. Thank you for that, Connie.
Michelle?
So another kind of along that same line, you were talking about the importance of the living labs as a way to practice environmental governance. And when I think about the difference between online and in person, that's one of the things that really pops up for me, is that governance is, requires a lot of trust, and also a lot of kind of checking in to make sure everybody's using the terms the same way. And I've seen that be an issue pretty much in any team effort that I've made, is when we're working across disciplines, what does this term mean to you, and how do we kind of, fix that? Did you spend much time on definitions?
Yes, absolutely. We spent at least the whole entire first year discussing what responsible innovation is. I had one idea, everybody has a different one. One of the things we did immediately was to develop a protocol of what it means, and like even single out things like, how are we going to have reflexivity built in? What are the roles for the graduate students? How is authorship decided? All of those things were and especially like, how is data going to be shared? I mean, I think that's a big problem in academia, where it's limited. People want their students to publish and get dissertations, and they don't want to publish, like they don't want to collaborate with new collaborators if they haven't worked on before. And here I was bringing South Dakota and Vermont and Virginia Tech together, and so I think it took us a lot of time just to get to know each other, trust each other, but also be able to understand what living lab is, what are the processes and how it's different. Like participatory action research, it's very difficult to understand, not just for researchers, but also for research organizations like NSF. So one of the things I had to do is constantly communicate with my program officer, tell him that, hey, now we're changing. Farmers want something else. We wanted them to have like all these amazing gadgets, and they're asking for something much simpler. So I think that all like that kind of, you need that coordination. Yes. Sorry, long answer.
No, that's good. It kind of tripped my thinking about ontologies. Did you take it to that point of trying to pull together ontologies for any of these systems?
Yeah, absolutely. So we published, because I wanted to document all this. This is such a big process. And so we just recently published the Journal of Responsible Innovation on how do you do interdisciplinary research where like on precision agriculture specifically. And over there, like, I think I wouldn't say that our ontological like beliefs are totally in line, but I think the whole idea was that we made each other realize the different meanings of matter. Like, for instance, like, matter is such a common thing in the work that we do. What does it mean to like a farmer? Like soil organic matter is a matter. Like there's also a matter, like in terms of the way, I don't know if you're a social scientist, but Karen Berard uses the word mattering as a verb. And so like there are all these different ways in which things come to matter. And these decisions go together in the development of these AI, right? So what we were interested in was like, okay, so why are we choosing this indicator for soil carbon? What matters? Like, and what we realized what matters was that, we're limited by what the soil testing lab is going to present us. But when you look at the literature, there are like 12 different ways to measure soil organic matter. So I think like this, that discussion is very important. Like, and I think we had a good evaluator who helped us document this process, because a lot of times I was not able to, as being part of this conversation, I was not able to directly document it. So having an evaluator who's constantly like, paying attention to these nuances helps.
If I can jump in, I was going to ask you, I know it's best practice, and you talk about this in the inclusion principle, to involve users or target communities early in the process, if not at the origin of the process. Reality is an awful lot of AI and technological innovation is being done without that kind of process, and then people get brought in at the end stages. The problems I observe is that you often hardwired or locked in decisions that are difficult to roll back. But one of the litmus tests of when I've involved people is whether I've been able to see changes in the science that gets done, the questions that get asked, the trajectory of innovation that we might be actually producing. And I'm curious, it may be too early for your project, but do you have examples of, by bringing people in early, how you've been able to identify new questions, new opportunities, say, shift the trajectory of innovation or of change in the precision ag space, develop some new ways of framing problems or coming up with how to present solutions?
Yeah, I mean, there's some small minor ones, but I think so. Let me think. I mean, even in the design workshop, I'll give you an example of it's not as, it doesn't change the whole trajectory of the project, but it kind of like made us realize our own biases in some ways. So in the design workshop, when we were working with farmers in Vermont, we had this a beautiful idea about like this amazing dashboard that we'll create, and it's going to present all these different it will quantify different ecosystem services and so on. And then farmers were like, hey, can you create like a simple way in which we can document our nutrients, and so that we have to report every year to the government? Is there any way that you can actually document that process for us? And that's basically what we want, is like a diary. and so we were like, oh, okay, that sounds like a small computer science project that an undergraduate could help with. So a lot of times what we've been able to do is to not change the direction of the project, but to spin it off as an undergraduate computer science project. And that has helped us because we can't entertain everything, but it also works out for the student. So yeah, I think that's one of the examples. The other thing that we've we have I mean, I think like a lot of times, like even when you present maps and like maps that are generated by our computer science team to the farmers, they still want like they want some explanation about it, and so even like some of the there is this thing called as thing explainer. There are hundred of thousand words that you're not supposed to be using when you explain something. And so we've kind of used that as a way to really bridge that knowledge, which is that like none of those words can be used to explain anything. And so anytime that word comes, we have to kind of simplify it down. So we're constantly thinking about ways in which science can be communicated. But you're right, like it's still so much in process that like I don't have like an exact answer for you about the kind of questions you're asking. They were definitely interesting, something to think more about.
Mm-hmm.
One kind of following up on that, the first thing that came to my mind is this sounds really productionist. And did any of those kinds of issues come to the table, looking at structure of agriculture rather than just how do we produce more? I mean, I guess as soon as you brought in water and soil quality issues, that starts to get at some systemic pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one of my students is working on one of his dissertation chapter is looking at how these formulas that are used to calculate nitrogen, how they are performative in ways in which they're trying to maximize the yield, right? And so what happens in the end is that these and like, so what are some of the ways in which these formulas come about? Like, so some of that is, I mean, a lot of these formulas are being generated by university researchers at universities, And then, but what happens actually is that like there's this, farmers have some amount of nitrogen that's left over. They're just going to spread it. They're not going to keep it, right? And so I think there's some tensions that are happening that we're seeing in our project that are more systemic, like, why formulas exist in this and the way they do, and why are they trying to maximize yield only? Is there something else that needs to be maximized as well? There could be several different objectives, including profits. I mean, like, that's some farmers want to maximize profits than yield. And so we're trying to get to that, but I think but in terms of a solution, we haven't kind of thought about it much, I guess. Did that answer the question? I feel like I kind of, maybe if you ask me one more time, I can rephrase it.
No, I thought you did great.
Good.
I mean, I want to kind of, for us, this is a conversation I have with myself and with some of our ICICLE colleagues. What is our theme is democratizing AI, and so we really love to see our project be a model for how to do this work in a way that brings more voices, more ease of participation, fewer barriers of entry to both participate in and shape the development and innovation process. And it's a question really of when to do that. So how early is it to bring in, and in what formats do you bring in people? And then I think I know the answer to that in principle, but in practice, it's a little bit harder. And what are some of the things we would have to be prepared for if we start bringing people into that process earlier and earlier in the innovation? As scientists and engineers and folks working to innovate, messing with stakeholders can complicate your life and make things slower and less predictable. And you've already mentioned, like, graduate students need to graduate, people need to publish papers. There's a lot of imperatives built into the system that makes incorporating folks early on to a scientific process more difficult, or at least scary.
Yeah, I mean, I think so I think it depends, like, if it's, so I think I would like to know more about ICICLE, because it seems like you don't have there's no one end user, right? There can be multiple end users, and so that makes it even more difficult, because you don't have a sense of who your target audience is. Like, it can be several different stakeholders at the same time. But I think like for us, what has helped is, like, even with these games, right? Like, even with the CAUSA experiment, where we actually pay farmers incentives for them to reduce their nitrogen or phosphorus, that could potentially lead to a disaster, like if they actually lose yield, right? Based on what we're telling them. So we don't actually, so for that reason, we have to first, we didn't roll out the experiment like in the first year. We developed trust with them. But with that trust, we also told them that they don't necessarily have to, if they don't want to be part of that experiment. So I think, like, giving people the opportunity to participate as much as they want, and being clear that, what are some of the limitations of this? What are some of the things that we cannot do as a researcher? We can't possibly, like, do everything. But I think that transparency can be built if you, instead of like trying to bring in a lot of people, if you can bring fewer people, and have sort of different expert groups, and then, like, finding ways in which maybe, AI can learn from those different expert groups, either in some ways, in some kind of iterative way. I think that way of adaptive learning would be better, instead of like trying to find a large variety of like a big groups of a big number of people in each group. So that might help, I think. But I think with the design workshops, what it does is it kind of like simplifies the problem in many ways, with what these technologies are. Like a lot of people don't really know what these are, and so like getting them to play with it in some ways, in some low fidelity ways that they can be able to engage with it and see what are some of the potential opportunities that can come from there. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting insight, Maaz. We worked on a kind of a policy systems model with an economist to look at dairy policy. And once we had a model that people could play with, could put their own farm numbers in, it suddenly dawned on them what they were seeing and how this might affect them. But we weren't able to get that same kind of response before we had a way for them to play with it. And, and it also becomes more like game-like, you know, it's less like asking for faith in something
Yeah.
and more like something they can experiment with and mess around with a bit.
Exactly. And I think that's so yeah, so any kind of like any type of participatory modeling helps, or like you're describing something like a system dynamics model that farmers can play, or whoever can play and learn what the impact would be. So we're trying to develop something like that through the different process-based models that can create different scenarios that, if you have these kind of farming practices and these are your inputs and these are the type of outputs that you can achieve. And then we present that information but then for the other fields, we present better information, which provides some amount of bias correction or provides some level of uncertainty as well about those scenarios. And so I think one of the things we're trying to understand is how does better information help develop trust in that. And so I think maybe starting there, and then seeing what might be the impact of a project, of your size. It's an AI Institute project. It's supposed to be an institute that will serve the needs of the communities for much longer than X number of years. And so I think having that set now, even just finding out what works, is great scientifically, I think.
Well, I know a lot of us have to jump off to new things at the top of the hour. If there's one last burning question someone wants to ask. If not, I was going to thank Maaz for the time, and I really appreciate you sharing your project with us. We look forward to seeing where it goes, and maybe we'll find some opportunities to intersect these two projects down the road, which would be pretty exciting. So.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate everyone for attending. Thank you.
Thank you, Maaz.
Take care. Bye.